Senator Cory Booker, that's right. Rise up, Senator, from your shackles and your overpaid job. To undo, I love that little dead animal on your head. To undo the stain of slavery, which is very interesting. This guy is completely, and as well as the rest of the Democrat presidential candidates, are a bunch of hypocrites. Why? I certainly would say, well, one thing, Kamala Harris, her family owned slaves on her father's side of English descent. And look at who he's with. You know what, Jimmy Carter, when he started his campaign to be president, gotta love him. He started it in the quarters of the KKK, which is the Democrat Party. I keep telling you that. Remember, he was caught in the bathroom soliciting a guy for gay sex, and then all of a sudden he finds this actress, this beautiful actress. Would you play the part of the First Lady for me, and we can get married in the White House? We could be like the Obamas 2.0, because you're so beautiful, and we'll make some beautiful babies. Except I don't think so, because I don't think Cory Booker is as attractive. Obama is attractive, but Cory Booker is not attractive. So I don't think you'll be making any beautiful babies anytime soon. Look at him. Look at this picture here. He looks like he's the new incarnation of Bill Cosby, going to do a Jell-O Pudding Pops commercial. No, this whole thing isn't going to be a voiceover. Just going to start. I just want to add a few more tidbits about the hypocrisy of these people. Spartacus Booker here. He proposes to enact reparations into law. Of course, Kamala Harris goes along with it. Is she going to pay? Her family owned slaves. Her mother was from India. Her father was British, and they owned slaves in Jamaica. Of anyone, she is responsible, and responsible twice, being a Democrat, the party of slavery in the KKK and Jim Crow. So she needs to pay twice. That's what I say. This bill will do one of two things. Flag anyone who votes against it, riling up the SJWs and African American community, or the BLM community, to a point where we will see riots in the streets to throw opposition out of office amongst violent acts, including a do not serve policy at establishments across the country. 2. The Democrat Party will reel back the African Americans who've left, disillusioned by the fact that the Democrats care more about illegal immigrants than them. Right now, African American students suffer because schools are overburdened by the influx of illegal immigrant children who cannot read or write in their own language, much less English. That the African American students are being completely neglected. They graduate with an 8th grade or lower reading level, or drop out completely, leaving no future for them. Money is better spent on communities of African Americans to bring up their living situation, offering jobs and continued assistance to ensure the father stays in the home with his children and his wife, instead of the old Democrat agenda demanding the father cannot reside in his home with his children in order for his children and his wife to attain said benefits. Who are these Democrat presidential candidates' saviors? And are they really saviors at all? Who pays for the reparations? Not them, the American taxpayers, who have no ties to slavery at all. Do the illegal immigrants pay? Do they have a tie to slavery? Why, yes, their ancestors got 95% of the transatlantic slave trade, while America, the United States of, got only 5%. Meanwhile, they're telling these illegal immigrants that we hate them because of our racism and that they are victims. Victims? Very few of us have ancestors that were actually involved in slavery. However, those coming over the border are descendants of the ones who sacrificed their fellow people of the same race on altars of blood and took a total of 9,500,000 slaves, while America got 500,000 at the top and ended it here. We ended it first. South America's sin of slavery is a huge debt that the Democrats and socialists have wiped clean, much like their own stain of slavery. They are the ones responsible for slave trading, owning, KKK, and Jim Crow laws. They happily pin it on the innocent with no connections to their crimes. Today, they sow division, much like they did in the days of slavery, pushing us forward into the streets to engage in civil war. Are they going to pay these noble Democrat socialist presidential candidates? Why, they never do. Not one penny of their income, nor do they suffer the loss as we will. These Democrat socialist presidential candidates, are paid by us to solve all problems with only one answer: raise the taxes on the people. Then they vote themselves pay raises, which we pay. If they do choose to drop a penny into the tin of reparations, it's our penny that they drop. Good going, fake patron saints of slavery. As Christ said, hypocrites all. Now on with the show, and me live. Hello everybody. You know what I was thinking about today? I heard that Cory Booker, Camille Harris, of course Camille Harris definitely should do something about slavery, since her family owned slaves in Jamaica. But Cory Booker, who might even benefit from this, because I think he might be biracial. I think he's not 100% descendant of African slaves. He put up a bill for reparations, and it seems like the Democrat Party is really jumping on this because they're the party of minorities and women, even though they're the party that prevented women from getting the vote. When they heard that women wanted to vote Federalist, they voted against giving women the right to vote. And they are the party of slavery, slave owners, slave traders, KKK and Jim Crow South. Let's not ever forget that. That's why the Democrat Party is always so obsessed with showing the minorities that they are actually the party, and women the party for minorities and women, when they're actually not. Anyway, so he wants reparations for the people who are descendants of African slaves. And in Nazi Germany, well, after Nazi Germany, they gave reparations to Jews who were victims of people who were actually victims of the Holocaust. They were alive, they were in concentration camps, they actually suffered, and they were still alive, so for the rest of their lives, Germany gave them reparations. Right now, there are no living slaves, former slaves, in America. And most of the people in America kind of came after, have no connection with slavery. And slavery, since it was the South, there's about 1% of the people owned slaves. It was the 1%ers that owned slaves. That would be the people, the ones that owned slaves, or those who traded slaves, anybody who belonged to the KKK or was a part of Jim Crow South. I'd say any of those people would be responsible for paying reparations. And of course, all of those people are the Democrat Party, because it was the Democrat Party that did all this. They were all members of the Democrat Party. And since, of course, if Greeks and Southern Italians were also lynched down there, considered half black and subject to, then maybe you would have to exclude them from having to pay reparations as well. But you definitely would want to make sure that whoever pays for reparations would be their descendants, their ancestors. The sin of their ancestors falls upon you, kind of like the sins of the father, whatever your ancestors did, you're responsible for. I would think personally, it would be somebody active today that was owning slaves today that should be paying reparations. So of course they should be thrown in jail. Anybody who's causing oppression of the African American community in some way, somebody who's keeping them from excelling or putting conditions on them, like if the father's in the home, you're not going to get welfare. Who's ever doing that and keeping them from advancing in life? There was a thing called affirmative action, which means if two people are applying for a job and they have equal qualifications, but one is black and one is white, the black person will get the job. If you're applying for college, one is black and one is white, or one is Asian. If you're Asian, you're deducted points. And if you're black, you have points added. So you kind of get a little benefit there if you're going to college. So there are ways that America has tried to figure out how to help African Americans, but primarily the communities that are suffering the most that are African American are communities that are run by the Democrat Party, the same party that enslaved them and kept to Jim Crow South and the lynching and the KKK. That's the party that pretty much rules over all the African Americans that are suffering, the communities. There's not the ones that are excelling and in college and all that stuff and making good wages, but the oppressed communities are all run by Democrats. So I said several videos back, who's ever going to pay referee should be the Democrat Party. Also should be the Democrat Party that pays for everybody that comes, since they want them to come over the border. They want all these voters, these new Democrat voters. They're not going to help the African Americans. They're jumping off the Democrat bandwagon because they're waking up. They need new voters. So since they want these people coming over the border, the Democrats should pay for their, they get 100% on the dole and can work under the table. Well, then the Democrats should pay for it since they want them. If you're a Democrat, you're a registered Democrat, you should have a special tax. You should have a special tax to pay reparations. I agree with that. To these black communities. And also to pay for the migrants that are coming over the border. Now, this talk is going to be about slavery. And we've got some modern day slavery going on here as well. We're going to get into that. And our focus really should be on modern day slavery and also repairing the damage that has been done to black communities that are still suffering today, that are run by an all Democrat city council, mayor, governor, whatever, all the politicians, the Congress people, all those Democrats that are running these oppressed communities, because apparently they're not doing a very good job because these poor people are still being oppressed. So they should pay extra, especially the Democrats that make a lot of money should pay extra for the oppression of and choosing to belong to the Democrat. So it's kind of like, to me, if you call yourself a Democrat, you might as well call yourself a member of the KKK. What if the party was called the KKK party? Because that's what the Democrat Party is the KKK party. So if you're black, why would you call yourself a Democrat? Why would you want to be a Democrat? Because the name is synonymous with the KKK. So it might as well be. What party do you belong to? Well, the KKK party. the cake, that's what it is, and you should really call it, or the Jim Crow party, or the slave trader party, or the slave owner party, or the party that denied women the right to vote when they found out that the women wanted to vote Federalist. They denied them the right to vote. But let's look at the entire world, history of slavery, and it's going to be a condensed history. I'm not going to go into every single detail. But slavery has existed on this earth since the dawn of time. Quick history, why we look so different, have different cultures and customs. Races, different ethnicities and cultures developed over time. And so we started eventually looking more and more different. The reason why we look more and more different was because it depends on where we lived in proximity to the sun. Our melanin, as far as the color of our skin goes. If you live close to the equator, then you got a lot of sun, and your body needed to produce vitamin D. And so it needed only a certain amount of sunlight to produce vitamin D. You have to have vitamin D to prevent birth defects and a lot of health disorders. And if you live further away from the sun in the northern climates, then you needed to have very light skin because you had to draw in as much sunlight as possible, because it doesn't matter where you lived in proximity to the sun, you had to have a certain amount of sunlight to produce vitamin D. Doesn't mean somebody's better or worse, though people who lived in the north had different body shapes until the Neanderthals died out. Actually, all white people today have a modern body shape. Our body shape is the African body shape. It's the same that's modern day man. That's Homo sapiens sapien. There's Cro-Magnon man, and then it came to Homo sapien sapien. That's what we are. Advantages, disadvantages. Neanderthals had barrel-shaped bodies, which helped them survive the Ice Age, where modern man with African bodies could not. And Neanderthals, there's a very small percentage. It's either 0 to 4% that everyone has. Even people in Africa actually have some Neanderthal. They say, how could this possibly happen? They think either Neanderthals moved into Africa at one point, or they moved out. Africans moved out, mated with Neanderthals, and then moved back in. That's where that small percent, and a lot of Africans a descendant of African slaves, the Black community in America, have Neanderthal in them, because most of them have a percentage of Irish in them, believe it or not. So everybody, even though it doesn't look like you're mixed a little bit. So it also depends on what you ate and the terrain that you walked over. Your body adapted to where you lived and what you ate. And that had to do with, the changes in what we look like. So now I don't want to get into too much why we look so different, but the main point is that man, humankind, has been enslaving its own since the dawn of time. And it began when man first evolved into modern day man. There was a tribe, and then the tribe broke up. One group of people lived on one side of the river, the other group of people lived on the other side of the river. This group grew carrots, and this group grew turnips. And the chief of this tribe said, "Hey, I want turnips. We're going to go war on those other people." And the people in the other tribe, even though they're very close as far as racial, whatever goes, and they pretty much look the same, one tribe still considers the other tribe, even way back then, a whole different type of human. We looked at each other and saw differences, dressed differently. Maybe one tribe was more into red, the other tribe was more into yellow. And we we developed and grew differently. And then one tribe would conquer the other tribe, and they would absorb all their culture and their music into their tribe. And then we kept breaking up and evolving and becoming more and more different. It was man's inclination to dominate each other. Before we were countries, we were tribes. Some clearly that didn't want a war and were peaceful, but when you've got a tribe that's going to war on you, you've got to make war yourself. You have to say, look, we have to protect ourselves, because this tribe here is always conquering those other tribes. So what we've got to do is we've got to make war ourselves. So everybody kind of ended up warring and conquering each other. And as they did, absorbing cultures and music or eradicating people altogether and then using them as sacrifice. And yes, before the whole white thing got started, it was people with dark skin that was doing the warring and the sacrificing and sacrificing other people. But when you read anything from any liberal publication, they'll always say, yes, Native Americans enslaved other Native Americans. In fact, there's Native Americans also enslaved African Americans, whereas the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Cherokee owned African slaves. And these slaves were neither citizens of America, nor were they citizens of that tribe. They were just flat out slaves. Nobody kind of acknowledges that. That's why they say that some African Americans say they have some native ancestry in them. But they didn't realize that this ancestry came about because they were enslaved by the Native Americans. Or they'll look at photos of their ancestors and they'll see that they had long, straight black hair. And they assumed that they must be part Native American. But there was a study done, PBS. I say PBS because we know that that's liberal leaning. People don't trust conservatives. There's no twist to it. Tested all these African Americans that say that they had Native American ancestry in them. And it came out to be like less than 1%. It was ridiculously small. And most people, like Tina Turner, a lot of people thought, they claimed they were part Cherokee. Maybe because they were owned by Cherokee, maybe their ancestors were owned by Cherokee. And that's where the idea came down. And it's turned out she had zero. She doesn't have any Native American in her. But Michael Jackson claims to be part Cherokee, which Michael Jackson, well, I know Elvis is part Cherokee, and he's an official member of the tribe, but I kind of think about Michael Jackson, and he might have paid for that. I'm just thinking to myself, the guy had so much money, and he admired Elvis so much, he wanted to be like Elvis so much, he even took his moves, believe it or not, that I wouldn't put it past him to say, I'll buy tribal affiliation, because Native American tribes, a lot of them are terribly impoverished. People don't realize that. We're always thinking about these groups that are oppressed and these people coming on the border, and we give them all everything free off the dole once they walk over the border. You grab a kid, you get in for free. And we pay for everything and you work under the table. Yet the Native Americans in this country, there's some tribes that are so impoverished, it would make your head spin. And nobody is thinking about, hey, why don't we use this dole that we're paying for people that are walking over the border who are fake asylum seekers, because they know all they have to do is say, we're seeking asylum. I'm being oppressed, and a lot of them look like there's no way anybody could oppress them. They're pretty strong-looking guys. But we've got Native Americans in this country who are dying at a very young age and committing suicide and they're alcoholics, and we somehow threw them away, and we're only obsessed. Oh yes, because the Democrat Party wants the votes. That's the reason why they want the votes. That's why they want these people coming in. They'll pay for these people, but you're going to neglect the Native Americans that are dying around us. That's really very noble of you, Democrats. So I added that. Let's not forget the Native Americans that are dying in this country at a very young age, by the way. Anyway, so getting back to slavery. Now, we know that the Slavs, the word slave comes from Slav, because the Slavs are the most enslaved people since the dawn of time. They were the most from everybody enslaved the Slavs, and they were white. And then the English starved out. They hated the Irish. So they basically starved them to death. And they took the men and they sold them into slavery. These men that were already starving to death. Their health was horrible shape. And they sold them out to the colonies. And they were sold for 5 silver coins. This is very interesting. 5 silver coins for an Irish slave. They weren't worth much, and they didn't live long. And then they had all these women and children left. And they said, we got all these women, so why don't we sell these people too? So they sold them. Now, in England, they tried to eradicate, it's a class system. They're white people doing evil to other white people. Isn't that, these white people came over and they didn't like brown. This whole idea is that they don't like brown people, and they came over to eradicate brown people or enslave brown people because white people hate brown people. But the English people also hate white people. They hated people of different classes that were beneath them. So if you were poor, they really wanted to eradicate the poor, kind of like Margaret Sanger put the abortion clinics in all the poor communities, trying to eradicate the minority communities. That's what she did. Well, England had a way of doing that too, is that if you were poor and you stole anything, there's a case where a woman stole a hand trowel, so she could plant vegetables, and she was sold into slavery. See, what they originally did was they hung you. They just killed anybody. If you stole a piece of bread, you were hung. It was the death penalty for everything. That was their way of eradicating poor people. And then they realized, hey, why don't we start selling these people? They started selling. So white people, these poor white people, were being sold for 5 silver coins. And in Africa, there was a lot of wars going on. See, slavery did exist in Greece, everywhere. Slavery existed everywhere. But 1400 years ago, with the advent of Islam, they started the African slave trade. Onto the Arab, Muslim, African slave trade, and all the Africans would war against each other, and the winning tribe would sell the losers as slaves. And usually it's like that's why they call it a slave trade, just because they traded it for guns, or they traded them for other goods, whatever they wanted. Guns that would make them more powerful, and they would be more apt to win the war if they traded the slave for guns. They'd definitely win the war. So Islam is actually, in Arabia, the slave trade, when they took African slaves, was a little bit different than the Americas. They wanted basically women and eunuchs, the women as sex slaves. And when a child was born of a union between an Arab and an African woman, they killed the child immediately. And that's why you don't really see African, even though they took African slaves into a number that we have no idea. The number is so great, we have no idea. Into Arabia, you're not going to find Africans in Arabia. They made the men eunuchs because the whole idea of the well-endowed African man, the Arabs had the men were kind of envious of it. So what they did was they castrated them, and only one man in 30 survived. So most of them died because you bleed to death. Just like when the female genital mutilation, that also will cause a little girl to bleed to death as well. And even a baby, because they do it from the time they're born up to the age of 5 or 6 is when they do that to the woman. But so it's estimated 200 million Africans died because of that, you know, from the babies getting killed and the men getting castrated. Probably more than that, because to this day, their slave trade is still going on in the Muslim world. Yes, there were the Barbary pirates, Muslims of the Barbary coast, the upper coast of Africa, who enslaved 2 million southern Europeans. Yes, white slavery, believe it or not. So slavery by Islam was not just black Africans. Being an infidel or non-Muslim was the requirement. That is why Thomas Jefferson owned a copy of the Quran, not because he was or admired Islam. It was so he could understand the force he was up against, who they were and why they were killing and enslaving Americans. There's about 43 million slaves that exist in the world today. There's about 6 million slaves that exist in Africa, that black Africans own other black Africans. And this is very important because this is present day. And also young women in Europe are being stolen. Very young women, little girls are being stolen to be sex slaves in the Muslim world. And remember, is it Nigeria, while the Obamas were in office, that they had taken over a school and they took all the little girls and they let the little Muslim girls go, but they kept the Christian girls, and then they turned them into sex slaves. And Michelle Obama held up that hashtag Bring Our Girls Back, which did a lot of good. You know, her husband was the president of the United States. He didn't do anything to help those Nigerian girls. They were black, they were Christian. Only difference, they were Christian. We have no idea what happened to those little girls, but these are examples of slaves today. You know, so the Democrat Party is obsessed with reparations, and they are obsessed with slavery. So let's come back to the Americas. Here's the world. Here's the world. The world right now. The slaves that are being taken, or exist, the countries that are taking slaves, are not considered white. They're not white countries, and they're not Christian countries, except there is one Christian country. It's America. Yes, slavery is still happening in America. How? Well, that open border, it's called human trafficking, sex slavery. See, they bring these children over, and the reason why they're separated, and Obama started separating them. That's the thing. Obama is the one who started separating them and putting them in cages. You know what Ocasio-Cortez says that, and they're putting them in cages. That's what Trump is doing, and giving them drugs. She sounds like Shirley Temple, for God's sakes. Because they're coming in with diseases. It's called inoculation. We're trying to heal them. Okay, it's not trying to kill them. And the reason why they're separated, Obama did that too. Obama started the whole separating because these children were being brought in as sex slaves. They don't have anything to do with what you call kidnapped. They were kidnapped, basically, or sold by their parents to these people who are bringing them over the border for just either to get over the border or to be sold into sex slavery as human slaves. So I would have to say that yes, slavery does exist in the Christian world. Correction, not Christian world, Democrat world. That's why they stay. That's why they're even here. because it exists in America, because you have an open border where people are bringing in children and women and even men as slaves and sex slaves. Yes, and the Democrat Party, who was the party of slavery, still is the party of slavery because you want that border open. So yes, you're the party of slavery, and you're the ones who should pay reparations, and you're the ones who should pay for everybody coming over the border, not anybody who's not a Democrat. It's your frickin' fault, okay? It's your frickin' fault. Except, this is the thing that pisses me off the most. You are saying, and you're turning all these different communities against the white people, saying, oh, it's the white people's fault, and we should pay reparations. Well, my family had nothing to do with this country when slavery went on. And when my family came over, they couldn't even go to the police because they were considered black, and the police wouldn't listen to them. And there was a white guy, and won't say his ethnicity, stole my grandparents every dime they had. My grandfather went upstairs to hang himself until my grandmother went up there to stop him. But he couldn't go to the police because he was considered black, and in the South he was considered black. Black, 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 and the police were Irish. They see the Irish were slaves at one time, and then all of a sudden they weren't slaves, and then they started discriminating against the Italians, saying the Italians were actually black, or the Southern Italians because they're darker skinned. Okay, so the Italians didn't get justice, and a lot of people in this country didn't get justice, and a lot of people were considered not white and had nothing to do with the slave trade. But the people you like the most are the people coming over the border. But the people who are at fault the most, that you keep saying, you Democrats keep saying are at the fault the most, is for some reason the people in the Western world, Western society, is the one that's actually at fault for slavery. How not true can this possibly be? First of all, it was the African tribes that sold other African tribes they brought them to the coast. The African slave trade was huge. There was no way that white people would know where to even go if they went into Africa. White slaves were sold for 5 silver coins. African slaves were sold for 50 silver coins. White slaves were starved near death and not worth much. Indentured servant, you say? Caveat, the masters could keep them for life, and in poor health. They didn't live to see freedom. And like Kunta Kinte, throw a net over Kunta Kinte and take them one at a time with all these boas and wild animals and tribes that would just kill them. If you come into Africa, you're dead. They were brought to the coast by the winning tribe. That's how they got to the coast. There's no way that these white people ever survived going into Africa. It was too tough for them. So they were brought to the coast and sold to the world. The Western world, the white Western world, which Christian world that you hate so much, had slavery for about 300 years. It existed in that world, yes, for about 300 years. And then a man named William Wilberforce wrote Amazing Grace, and he realized this was evil. You hear the song Amazing Grace. I once was lost and I was found, was blind, but now I see. He realized these are human beings and they should be free. And he led the fight to free the slaves in England. And then he came over to America because people started reading, our rights, saying that all men are created equal. I say, hey, there's something wrong here. All men are created equal, and all men have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And what they knew from the Bible on how you should treat your neighbor and love thy neighbor and all that stuff, all that Jesus stuff, all those things that Jesus said. That's the only thing people back then of literature, most people knew what they heard in church and what they knew of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, Declaration of Independence. This is what most people knew. at that time. You know, if you didn't read the literature of the day, or the literature that had been written up to that point, most people knew only these documents in America, and it didn't make any sense. So slavery, people said, you know, there's something wrong with slavery. And it dawned on the people of the Western world in America, where it existed for 300 years. People who were not white and not Christian had been enslaving other people for thousands of years. People in the Americas, the Aztecs, the Incas, the Toltecs, the Olmecs, all Native Americans enslaved other Native Americans, North and South and Central America. They did. The Aztec sacrifices and sacrifices in the Americas, where even in North America, they would steal braves from other tribes and skin them alive. It was brutal. It wasn't just the Aztecs. 5,000 to 6,000 people a day they'd cut the hearts out of. They'd put children on the Incas would put children on the mountaintops to freeze to death. It was, they would go to war. These civilizations living in America who were not white would go to war just to get people to sacrifice. That's what it was about. You turn your overeducated head to this because they were the same race. And somehow the evil that came into the Americas was when the Spanish and the Portuguese set foot in the Americas, which, you know, all these people south of the border, they're Hispanic, right? So they're descendants of the people who came over that you don't like. The white people that came over and brought Christianity and stopped all the human sacrifice and the slavery. You say they were white people, but those were the Portuguese and the Spanish that came over, and Columbus kind of led the way, but then they threw him in jail, and then the Spanish came over and converted everybody to Catholicism, and all that sacrifice ended. That brutal human sacrifice ended. I mean, there's a monument that's like 136,000, made of 136,000 human skulls, and it's a little bit of mortar, but it's just the whole thing is held up by human skulls. That's how awful and brutal it was. Some civilizations tortured prisoners of war slowly for 2 weeks before brutally sacrificing them to better gods than Jesus. And if you read anything, any liberal publication, you talk about the Native Americans owning slaves or owning the enslaved other Native Americans. And they say things like, well, it's different because it was the same race. Somehow it's only evil if a different race enslaves you. I don't understand that. I think it's human beings enslaving other human beings, and I don't care if it's worse if it's a different race. It's still slavery. It's still human sacrifice. It's still flaying people alive, which means cutting their skin right off, and then they wear the skin. It's still sacrificing children. But it's okay if it's the same race. I love the liberal logic. It just blows my mind. So, it's like, and you've got the story of the Black Hills, where the Sioux warred upon the Cheyenne and took the Black Hills from the Cheyenne. They massacred them. And we found massacres of thousands, like 5,000 Native Americans dead by another tribe of Native Americans, just massacring them all. Forensic evidence proved that the tribe who massacred them tortured them for weeks before slaughtering them. So much for that same race nonsense. And yet you will always say that somehow it's only the fault of these Western white people. It's only their fault. And they're the ones that really need to pay the price. They're the ones who have to pay for reparations, because for some reason the fault of slavery and human sacrifice, all the sins of the world, rests upon the white people that live in America. Even though they have nothing to do with it, even though they weren't even here when this happened. Somehow, but all the people south of the border are completely innocent of slavery, and not to mention human sacrifice. What about reparations for human sacrifice? A lot of these people coming over the border, their ancestors enslaved other people and human sacrifice and children. Yet, why are they innocent? And somehow people who have nothing to do with any of this are guilty because they're white. They have less melanin in their skin. It doesn't make any sense. You would think that these people coming over the border, they should also be guilty of being ancestors of sacrificing children and cutting hearts out of humans, 5,000 to 6,000 a day, and flaying people alive. I'm gonna take a sip. Why aren't they guilty? Oh, wait. The slave trade. Let's go back to the slave trade. Now, let's go back to the transatlantic slave trade. Now that our eyes we're being opened up to these people coming over the border, hey, if you're going to make the white people in this country pay for slavery, why don't you, all these people coming over the border? Oh, the same race, similar race. See, that's funny, the whole idea of similar race. You know, when you ask some African Americans, you'll ask, say, look, you believe that the Egyptians are black. Some believe that the Egyptians were all black, and they were probably a mixed race. Actually, the most ancient of them, they say their ancestors came from the Balkans, Greece, the Middle East. That's actually who they're the most ancient of Egyptians that they've found the DNA match. But anyway, let's say you believe some African Americans believe that they were all black, and when you say to them, well, they enslaved people from Nubia. In fact, there's ships which the body of the slave is the ship. And Tutankhamun, who they think is black, his sandals, and the bottom of his sandals, where his soles hit the sandals, there's Nubians, black Nubians, and there's chariots of the pharaohs, and you see the chariots, and they're crushing to death all these Nubians. But they say that's okay because it's the same race, or the Egyptians enslaved other people too, which is true. They enslaved in Syria. There's other groups of people they enslaved too. But in particular, you see the effigies of Nubians as slaves, either as a ship or being crushed to death or on the soles of the feet. So this whole idea of, yet nobody says that the Egyptians should pay any reparations, or nobody finds any ill or evil with ancient Egypt. Everybody just loves ancient Egypt and kind of passes that right off, right? But the only evil is the white people who are, even if you're a descendant of someone who owned slaves, and what if your family died in the Civil War trying to free slaves? Or what if you helped with the Underground Railroad? What if you lived your life for equality and trying to help and better people's lives? You still pay reparations because white people, but it was the Democrat Party in particular. It was the Democrat Party. These people were Democrats, and they were very wealthy who owned the slaves, okay? And there were also 10% of them were black. There were also slave owners that were also African. So it was kind of a class thing. It really wasn't a skin color thing. When you kind of open up your eyes, you've got Native Americans owning black slaves, and you've also got Africans owning black slaves. And then you've got the Africans in Africa that sold and owned black slaves. And today, there are 6 million Africans, Black Africans, owned by other Black Africans. And God forbid you're born albino, because in voodoo, if you're born an albino, you're Black, but you're born white, they chop pieces of your body off and they boil it because they think you're magical. Okay, so we forget about, and also there's 43 million slaves that exist in the world today in non-white, non-Christian countries. But of course, the women's marches, they're not going to go over to the Middle East and protest and how women are treated in those countries, because they'll throw them in jail or kill them on the spot. Or the Democrats in this country who want reparations, who hate the white people. Nobody who is protesting, who's still talking about slavery that happened in the Americas, that was abolished and is penalized by death. If you're caught, death is the penalty, by the way. They abolished slavery and death is the penalty. No, they're still talking about slavery that happened almost 200 years, ended almost 200 years ago at this point. While there are slaves in the world today that you are doing nothing about, you do not belong to walkfree.org, which you should. You're not going over to Africa trying to free those slaves. You're not stopping the auction blocks in Libya, which started when between Obama and Hillary got together and took down Gaddafi. And now the Muslims, ISIS, moved in and started caging Black Africans and selling them in auction blocks. It's about, I first heard about this about 4 or 5 years ago. I heard when it happened. Yeah, that's right, when it happened. And we had an African-American president that was responsible for starting, and Hillary Clinton was, and you hate Trump, is responsible for starting the slave trade back up in Africa. Or they still own slaves, because Muslim, it's in Islam, it's permissible to own slaves, and Black Africans owning Black slaves. But the new slave in Libya, well, it didn't exist in Libya until the Obama administration took it down. And somehow Trump is the racist when it was Hillary, between Hillary. That was her pet baby. She said she wanted Libya. And we came, we saw, he died. And then Gaddafi died. And that's when the auction blocks, and they started caging all the Black Africans. And then ISIS moved in, Islam moved in, and started selling them on auction blocks. And that's the woman that you wanted president, because she's not a racist, right? And neither is Obama, who presided over this, because it's his administration. That's really, really interesting. And that, you know what? Methinks thou dost protest too strongly. That's from Shakespeare, meaning that the one who's guilty of the sin is the one yelling the loudest, is the one that's up there condemning the person, condemning someone else of the crime that they're guilty of. That's what's going on. But somehow, I'm going to get back to the transatlantic slave trade, because we really need to do that. Well, 5% of the transatlantic slave trade, 5% of the Africans came to America. And because they were in agriculture, we didn't castrate them. We have this country is populated with African Americans, and who've become very successful in many different fields. And they earn tens of millions of dollars in many. You can think of the many fields that they excel in, but not in Arabia. But somehow Arabia is good because you say they're not white, but in that country, they actually killed them. They don't exist there. They took them as slaves, but they didn't exist there because they killed them. But they're still better than the white people in America somehow. But America, unlike South America, African Americans have excelled in more than in any other country in the whole world. Despite the fact they came over in chains, the music industry and sports And then you've got professors, you've got academics, you've got all sorts of excelling. George Washington Carver was a slave, and he became an academic, and he was brilliant. He was a genius, and he was and Booker T. Washington, former slaves, started Tuskegee University, for God's sakes. So in America, unlike South America, the slaves that came to America, I'm talking about just the United States of America, descendants of African slaves have excelled. They have been held back. There are communities that are held back. Yes, Democrat-run communities. And there are others that have absolutely excelled and earned tens of millions of dollars. Well, we got, or America, I don't say we, but America, United States of America, got 5% of the transatlantic slave trade. 95%, because there's 100%. That 5% represents 500,000. 95% went to South America. You know, all these wonderful people who are coming over the border, who you will not ask for reparations, but you will pay, and you will make the American taxpayers pay for them on the dole, and then rich people can hire them for a quarter of the wage and not pay workers' comp or unemployment insurance. They get them really cheap, but they're doing it on our backs because we're paying for it. These people who you do not put the stain of slavery on, the Democrat Party is the party of slavery, but the Democrat Party is putting the stain of slavery on conservatives, white people who have nothing to do. Republican Party is the one that abolished slavery. These people, they got 95%. That's 9,500,000 African slaves went south of the Rio Grande. And not one, Cory Booker and all the people in the Democrat Party who are running for president who want reparations, not one of them are saying, wait a second, we're not going to let anybody, first of all, we're going to not let anybody come in from south of the border. They took 9,500,000 slaves. These people owe reparations. In fact, if they want to come to this country, they are going to have to pay for reparations for people who were brought over here, their ancestors, nobody alive today, brought over here from Africa. They're the ones who, if anybody's got the stain of slavery on them, and they celebrate Columbus Day in South America, and they celebrate Spanish Conquistador Day, the day that in this country, the SJWs have changed it to Indigenous Peoples Day. Indigenous Peoples Day. We can't celebrate Columbus Day or Spanish, but they're celebrating it south of the border. And the SJWs, they love all the people south of the border. The people who love to celebrate Spanish Conquistador Day or Columbus Day. The people who took 95% of the slave trade. The people who were the Aztecs and the sacrifices and enslaving the people and killing off other people, lots of killing and hearts getting cut off. These are the best people. We must give them more money, and we must make the American, especially the white people in America, we are so guilty of the crime of slavery. It would make your head spin, Everything I've given you tonight is fact. How? What are they talking about? The people who should be paying the black people money are the people who are coming over the border, and the Democrat Party. Anybody's foolish enough to belong to the Democrat Party in this country. I think I've said enough. And I gave you another video about Mr. Possum, which is a fun video. I suggest you watch. You'll learn a lot about how much we need possums, okay? Anyway, so this was a serious video, and I think I gave you a lot of really good information. And tell me, Tell me why somebody who has less melanin in their skin is responsible for slavery when their family and their people had nothing to do with it and never benefited from white privilege because my family was not considered white, though I came out white. I mostly, according to DNA, it's unbelievable. I knew this already. I'm like over 70% not white at all whatsoever. Actually, more than that. It's actually like, I'm like 80% not white. It's really funny. But DNA genetics is funny like that. But you'll probably make me pay for something that my people are not guilty of. And the white people in this country are not guilty, except for the Democrats. If you're a Democrat, yes, you should pay reparations. I'm totally for reparations. If you're a Democrat, because you're a hypocrite, methinks thou protest too strongly. Okay, good night, everybody. Hope you learned a lot this time.